Brace yourself. Get it passed up anytime now. Collect yourself. Things will never be the same in a sad, sad world.
Welcome, everybody. As I mentioned in the last video, been having some technical issues with the in-class videos not being saved, undoubtedly due to the moronitude of your teacher. So here we are, just you and me. We're going to cover Sophie's World Chapter 5, the chapter called Democritus. If you so take out your Sophie's Worlds, open to the beginning of chapter 5. It's page 43 in the green version. I don't know what page it is in the PDF or other versions, but just look in your table of contents. If you need to pause the YouTube video right now to go find your book, go ahead and do that. I'll wait. Rodrigo, what's taking them so long? Oh, you're back. Okay. Chapter 5, Democritus. By the way, it's pronounced Democritus or Democritus, and I'm slowly learning that almost everybody who knows what they're talking about says Democritus, so I just feel dumber and dumber and dumber with each source I consult, but, you know, I'm sticking with it. Democritus is what I'm saying. Democritus, the most ingenious toy in the world. Sophie put all the typed pages from the unknown philosopher back into the cookie tin and put the lid on. She crawled out of the den and stood up for a while, looking across the garden. She thought about what happened yesterday. Her mother had teased her about the love letter again at breakfast this morning. Hey, by the way, some of the classes we talked about this and some of the classes we didn't. This keeps happening to Sophie. Her mom does it. Joanna, her friend at school, does it. So Sophie's obviously she's acting different. She's got a lot going on, and it doesn't occur to anyone that she may actually be doing something important. What does everybody assume has got her so distracted? They assume she's in love. She's a 14-year-old girl. They assume she's boy crazy. She's got a crush on somebody. Look, there's nothing wrong with being boy crazy when you're a 14-year-old girl. But notice how, because of her age and her gender, because she's 14, because she's a girl, nobody even bothered to think that she may be up to something really important, something real meaningful. They've dismissed her. What Sophie's going to do is she's going to surprise everybody. And you've all got that same power. Your hidden power, because 14 is about the median age of my students right now. Your hidden power is nobody's going to see your greatness coming, and yet you have it in you just like Sophie does. So don't let them write you off just because you're young or because they don't respect your gender or don't respect your ethnic background or don't like the language you speak or whatever. You show them. You show them you've got greatness hidden in you just like Sophie does. Back to it. Her mother had teased her about the love letter again at breakfast this morning. She walked quickly over to the mailbox to prevent the same thing from happening today. Getting a love letter 2 days in a row would be doubly embarrassing. There was another little white envelope. Sophie began to discern a pattern in the deliveries. Every afternoon, she would find a big brown envelope. When she read the contents, the philosopher would sneak up to the mailbox with another little white envelope. So now Sophie would be able to find out who he was. If it was a he, she had a good view of the mailbox from her room. If she stood at the window, she would see the mysterious philosopher. White envelopes don't just appear out of thin air. Sophie decided to keep a careful watch the following day. Tomorrow was Friday, and she would have the whole weekend ahead of her. She went up to her room and opened the envelope. There was only one question today, but it was even dumber than the previous 3. Why is Lego the most ingenious toy in the world? For a start, Sophie was not at all sure she agreed that it was. It was years since she had played with the little plastic blocks. Moreover, she could not for the life of her see what Lego could possibly have to do with philosophy. But she was a dutiful student. Rummaging on the top shelf of her closet, she found a bag full of Lego blocks of all shapes and sizes. For the first time in ages, she began to build with them. As she worked, some ideas began to occur to her about the blocks. They are easy to assemble, she thought. Even though they are all different, they all fit together. They're also unbreakable. She couldn't ever remember having seen a broken Lego block. All her blocks looked as bright and new as the day they were bought, many years ago. The best thing about them was that with Legos, she could construct any kind of object. And then she could separate the blocks and construct something new. What more can one ask of a toy? Sophie decided that Legos really could be called the most ingenious toy in the world. But what it had to do with philosophy was beyond her. She had nearly finished constructing a big doll's house. Much as she hated to admit it, she hadn't had as much fun in ages. Why did people quit playing when they grew up? When her mother got home and saw what Sophie had been doing, she blurted out, "What fun! I'm so glad you're not too grown up to play." "I'm not playing," Sophie retorted indignantly. "I'm doing a very complicated philosophical experiment." Her mother sighed deeply. She was probably thinking about the white rabbit in the top hat. When Sophie got home from school the following day, there were several more pages for her in a big brown envelope. She took them upstairs to her room. She could not wait to read them, but she had to keep her eye on the mailbox at the same time. So we begin the letter. The Atom Theory. Here I am again, Sophie. Today you're going to hear about the last of the great natural philosophers. His name is Democritus, lived from about 460 to 370 BC, and he was from the little town of Abdera on the northern Aegean coast. If you were able to answer the question about Lego blocks without difficulty, you should have no problem understanding what this philosopher's project was. Democritus agreed with his predecessors that transformations in nature could not be due to the fact that anything actually changed. Remember that these pre-Socratic philosophers we've been talking about the past couple of weeks, what are they looking for? One, the basic constituent substance. What is it that makes up everything? What is the Play-Doh? And then how do we explain change? Because the Play-Doh doesn't just stay Play-Doh, it gets made into a unicorn. It gets made into a life-size model of Omar Greeny, and then you sort of rip the head off for your own amusement. How does it change from one thing into another? How does stuff change? That's what they're looking for. He therefore assumed that everything was built up of tiny, invisible blocks, each of which was eternal and immutable. Immutable. What's that mean? It means unchangeable. See that the four letters in there, muta, in the middle of that word? Think of mutant or mutate. If something mutates, if something is a mutant, it has changed into something else. He therefore assumed that everything is built up of tiny invisible blocks, each of which was eternal and immutable. Democritus called these smallest units atoms. The word atom means uncuttable. For Democritus, it was all important to establish that the constituent parts that everything else was composed of could not be divided indefinitely into smaller parts. If this were possible, we call that an infinite regress. It gets smaller and smaller and goes on forever. We can't have that. If this were possible, they could not be used as blocks. If atoms could eternally be broken down into ever smaller parts, nature would begin to dissolve like constantly diluted soup. Moreover, nature's blocks had to be eternal because nothing can come from nothing. In this, he agreed with Parmenides and the Eleatics. That's our first natural philosophers or pre-Socratics that were from the town of Elea, Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes, the Eleatics. Also, Democritus, he believed that all atoms were firm and solid, but they could not all be the same. If all atoms were identical, how there would still be no satisfactory explanation for how they could combine to form everything from poppies and olive trees to goat skin and human hair. I have very few human hair atoms on top of my head anyway. What's wrong with me? Democritus believed that nature consisted of an unlimited number and variety of atoms. Some were round and smooth, others were irregular and jagged. And precisely because they were so different, they could join together into all kinds of different bodies. But however infinite they might be in number and shape, they were all eternal, immutable, and indivisible. So Democritus has come up, or at least his school of thought has come up with the concept of atoms. He says 2,400 years ago, more than 2,000 years before anyone ever looked into a microscope. Once the microscope was invented, modern science then finally proved he was right. Everything is built of atoms. Some of the things he thought atoms were like turned out to be a little off, but let's not let that distract us from how impressive it is that there's some guy with a brain on his, with a head on his shoulders, with a brain inside, just like you, put his brain to work, and without ever seeing them, his great grandchildren didn't live long enough to ever see an atom. But he just used his mind and figured out that that's pretty much how it had to be. Hugely impressive. But who knows what you're going to figure out that will make everyone else say, well, why didn't I think of that? Now, the details of what he thought atoms were like. Well, he thought they were eternal. Turns out, no, not eternal, but they're super duper old. If they're atoms of helium or hydrogen, they're 14 billion years old. They go all the way back to the Big Bang. If they're atoms of anything else, they're millions or even billions of years old, and they're formed in the hearts of long dead, exploding, dying stars. All right, so eternal? No, but super old. Immutable, can't be changed. Turns out not quite true. You can change an atom. I can turn, you give me some atoms of helium, I can turn them into atoms of gold. I can make, so all the atoms of helium, I don't actually have one, but if I had a helium balloon, all those atoms of helium, I could turn them into atoms of gold. All I need is the heart of a dying star. So they're not really unchangeable, but they're not very easy to change. And then indivisible. What's that mean? We've been saying that in the pledge. You've been saying that in the pledge every day for 9 years, 10 years, 11, 12 years. Indivisible means can't be divided, can't be cut up into smaller pieces. Well, turns out that what we call atoms today actually can be cut up into smaller pieces. Those are subatomic particles, electrons, protons, neutrons, even smaller things, up quarks and down quarks, and all the other things. Ashley O'Donnell, you need to help me out on these videos and explain subatomic particles, both to me and for me. All right. So yeah, atoms can be divided, but what happens is what we call an atom is not the smallest possible unit of everything. That might be a string or a superstring according to string theory, but the smallest unit of any element that is still that element. So if I've got 10 atoms of gold, and that's about my net worth, I'm worth about 10 atoms of gold, I've got gold. Not very much, but I've got real gold. If I've got 1 atom of gold, I've got real gold. If I've got less than an atom, and you can have smaller than an atom, but then I don't have gold anymore. Then I have protons and electrons and subatomic particles and all that. So the atom's not the smallest unit of anything, but the smallest unit of any element. All right. He says they're indivisible. They can be divided, but you don't want to do that. When a nuclear bomb goes off and there's a nuclear explosion, you know what causes the explosion? Yeah, that's the energy released when we split one atom. As tiny as they are densely packed energy. Matter is pretty much just compressed energy. That is about the extent of my scientific knowledge on the subject, but I seem to recall hearing somewhere that matter is just compressed energy, and tons and tons and tons of energy compressed into tiny, tiny, tiny form. So you can divide an atom, you can split an atom. You don't want to do it. I used to always worry when I'm cutting up my steak, what if I accidentally cut right down the middle of one of my steak atoms? But that's mostly because I'm dumb. All right, back into this bottle of water I go, then back into the book we go. When a body, a tree or an animal, for instance, died and disintegrated, the atoms dispersed could be used again in new bodies. Atoms moved around in space, but because they had hooks and barbs, they could join together to form all the things we see around us. Today, not exactly how it works, but they do join together. So now you can see what I mean about Lego blocks. They have more or less the same properties as those which Democritus ascribed to atoms. And that is what makes them so much fun to build with. They are first and foremost indivisible. Then they have different shapes and sizes. They are solid and impermeable. Impermeable, you can't get into them. You can't penetrate them. This is Democritus, not necessarily modern science. They also have hooks and barbs so that they can be connected to form every conceivable feature. These connections can later be broken again so that the new figures can be constructed from the same blocks. The fact that they can be used over and over and over is what has made Legos so popular. Each single Lego block can be part of a truck one day and part of a castle the day after. We could also say that Lego blocks are eternal. Children of today can play with the same blocks their parents played with when they were little. I mean, he's not being literal there, that the Lego blocks don't last forever, but they're super hard to break. If you step on one, you know that your foot loses that battle and the Lego wins that battle. So huge quotation marks around eternal, but it's just an analogy. We can form things out of clay too, but clay cannot be used over and over because it can be broken up into smaller and smaller pieces. These tiny pieces can never be joined together again to make something else. Today we can establish that Democritus' atom theory was more or less correct. Nature really is built up of different atoms that join and separate again. A hydrogen atom in a cell at the end of my nose was once part of an elephant's trunk. A carbon atom in my cardiac muscle, that's my heart. We're not allowed to say things clearly and simply because it's school. A carbon atom in my cardiac muscle was once in the tail of a dinosaur. Remember the Stardust project from first quarter? That was the whole purpose of the Stardust project. When we say you are Stardust, we said every piece of you was built millions of years ago in the heart of a dying star. I don't mean your foot. I mean the atoms that make up your foot and your knee and your eye and everything. Those atoms, those smallest pieces of you, were built in the heart of dying stars. And those atoms have been, just like Legos. This is where the Lego comparison is so appropriate. Just like if you build a castle out of Legos, and then in comes mean old Maggie Potter, and she kicks it apart, and then she builds a warship out of the same Legos. Your castle's gone, man. But the Legos that were part of your castle, they're doing just fine. All the atoms in you have been part of many, many, many other beings in the past. Atoms are so small and they are so old and there are so many that you could basically fill in the blanks. An atom in me was once part of a blank. Fill it in with just about anything and you're almost certainly correct. So yeah, you got dinosaur atoms in you. And yeah, you got atoms from Julius Caesar's foot in you, probably. All right, because there's so many, so small, they get recycled like Legos over and over and over again. Back into the text. In our own time, however, scientists have discovered that atoms can be broken into smaller elemental particles. We call these elemental particles protons, neutrons, and electrons. These will possibly someday be broken into even lesser particles. And remember, this book is from the 80s, so some of what he's saying will someday probably happen, I believe has happened since the time it was written. You can ask Ashley O'Donnell. But physicists agree, or your science teacher, they're good too. But physicists agree that somewhere along the line there has to be a limit. There has to be a minimal part of which nature consists. So a smallest unit that actually cannot be broken down any smaller. And again, at least according to Brian Greene and Brian Greene and string theory, that might be these tiny little vibrating, one-dimensional vibrating strings of energy, I guess, called strings. Yes, that sentence was strings called strings. Why don't I just go shut up and go back to the book? Democritus did not have access to modern electronic apparatus. That's equipment, stuff. His only proper equipment was his mind. That's why I said you have everything that these philosophers had to work with. His only proper equipment was his mind. But reason left him no real choice. Once it is accepted that nothing can change, that nothing can come out of nothing, and that nothing is ever lost, then nature must consist of infinitesimal, super duper 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 small, infinitesimal blocks that can join and separate again. Democritus did not believe in any force or soul that could intervene in natural processes. The only things that existed, he believed, were atoms and the void, nothingness. Since he believed in nothing but material things, we call him a materialist. This is a term that you want to have in your notes. So let's take a look at it. Materialism. Materialism is the notion that only physical objects exist. When we say physical objects, what are we talking about? We're talking about matter and energy. Only physical objects exist. You can see why it's called materialism. All right. So stuff that you can see, smell, taste, touch. That's the only thing that's real if you're a philosophical materialist like Democritus. So Democritus doesn't want to talk to you about ghosts and spirits and gods and angels and supernatural forces. For Democritus or Democritus, again, they're both right. The way I say is probably less right, but I'm going to keep saying it. For Democritus, who's a materialist, it's only physical stuff that's real. Now, please, please, please listen carefully to this next thing I'm going to say. When we take our test next week, there's going to be a question on there that asks you to define materialism. And many of you, and it's an open note test, but many of you, instead of looking at your notes, are going to be Googling answers. And okay, it's open notes, so that's not cheating, that's not wrong, but please be warned. There are two meanings to this term. By far, the more common one to come up on Google is the other one, the one that we're not looking for. So the other meaning is that materialism is when you really like money and you really like stuff. I'm a materialist. Gimme, gimme, gimme. I got to get mine. You know, I love money more than people. Well, yeah, okay, that's materialism, but that's not the meaning we're talking about. Inevitably, heartbreakingly, half of you are going to ignore me and put that as your answer anyway, and it's going to be wrong. What we're looking for is philosophical materialism is the concept that only physical objects exist. That is the position held by Democritus. Okay, sip of water and we go back into the text. According to Democritus, there is no conscious design in the movement of atoms. In nature, everything happens quite mechanically. This does not mean that everything happens randomly, for everything obeys the inevitable laws of necessity. Everything that happens has a natural cause, a cause that is inherent in the thing itself. Democritus once said that he would rather discover a new cause of nature than be the king of Persia. The atom theory also explains our sense perception, thought Democritus. When we sense something, it is due to the movement of atoms in space. When I see the moon, it is because moon atoms penetrate my eye. Well, okay. It's not today, it's not, we know that's not exactly how it works, but when you see the moon, it is photons that have bounced off the moon and traveled all the way from the moon to your eyeball that are hitting your eyes. So he's, for a guy who's never seen a telescope, who's just using his noggin 2,500 years ago, not half bad. But what about the soul then? Surely that could not consist of atoms of material things. Indeed, it could. Democritus believed that the soul was made up of special round, smooth soul atoms. When a human being died, the soul atoms flew in all directions and could then become part of a new soul formation. This meant that human beings had no immortal soul, another belief that many people share today. You may agree, you may disagree. It's okay. You don't have to think what Democritus thought. Just understand what Democritus thought. This meant human beings had no immortal soul, another belief that many people share today. They believe, like Democritus, that soul is connected with brain and that we cannot have any form of consciousness once the brain disintegrates. Democritus' atom theory marked the end of Greek natural philosophy for the time being. Here, natural philosophy, remember, that's the branch of science all these pre-Socratics are practicing, or the branch of philosophy all these pre-Socratics are practicing, and that is what eventually will come to be called science. So what we today call science, back in the day, was called natural philosophy. Democritus' atom theory marked the end of Greek natural philosophy for the time being. He agreed with Heraclitus that everything in nature flowed, or changed, since forms come and go. But behind everything that flowed, there were some eternal and immutable things that did not flow. Democritus called them atoms. Let's get our highlights for Democritus now. Okay, so here he is. You'll often see him drawn smiling or laughing, just because many sources report that he was quite a joker and had a good sense of humor. Democritus lived from about 460 to 370 BC. And by the way, any of the images, any of these paintings are from long after his death, from the town of Abdera. He says everything is made of atoms, small, eternal, changeless, indivisible parts, right? Today, we know some of these details aren't quite accurate, but for his time, it was groundbreaking. They come in unlimited shape and size. And he also holds that only material things exist, and we call this materialism. Okay, let's finish up the chapter. During her reading, Sophie glanced out the window several times to see whether her mysterious correspondent had turned up at the mailbox. Now she just sat staring down the road, thinking about what she had read. She felt that Democritus' ideas had been so simple and yet so ingenious. He had discovered the real solution to the problem of basic substance and transformation. The problem had been so complicated that philosophers had gone around puzzling over it for generations. And in the end, Democritus had solved it on his own by using his common sense. Sophie could hardly help smiling. It had to be true that nature was built up of small parts that never changed. At the same time, Heraclitus was obviously right in thinking that all forms in nature flow. Because everybody dies, animals die, even a mountain range slowly disintegrates. The point was that the mountain range is made up of tiny, indivisible parts that never break up. At the same time, Democritus had raised some new questions. For example, he had said that everything happened mechanically. He did not accept that there was any spiritual force in life. Unlike Empedocles and Anaxagoras, Democritus believed that man had no immortal soul. Could she be sure of that? She didn't know. But then she had only just begun the philosophy course. Ladies and gentlemen, can you believe it? We covered an entire chapter of Sophie's World in under 6 weeks. 1 class period, 1 episode, 1 chapter, in and out, done. So I will not keep you any longer. Thanks for joining. And we've got, if you're watching this near the time I recorded it, we've got the test on the pre-Socratics next week. Open book, open note, because what point would it be to do it any differently in this age of remote learning? It is pretty tough. Look over the questions in the study guide and you'll be ready for it. Coming soon, we'll go back into Sophie's World, talk about fate, your fate and freedom essay. By the time anybody sees this, will already have been due. Therefore, disregard me in my entirety. Talk to you next time in class.
Around a lot a bit, trying to make the pieces fit to a puzzle with a million missing pieces. What I'm feeling fine is when I discover that I'm afraid to blow my cover, and there's something very wrong with this. So slip back in your hole, or get back in your cave. If I'm going down, I'm taking someone with me.